We live in extreme and interesting times. That wasn't it. I like it. Everything's crashing down around us. If you believe in science, then humanity is at a critical and unprecedented crossroads. Climate change tipping the balance of planetary life, ecosystems rapidly depleted, landscapes dramatically altered, and polar ice caps melting. As many of us are lawyers, we appreciate the weight of expert evidence, and there is not insignificant looming, voluminous information doing empirical heads on inaction around climate change in the world. I'm aiming to approach the following from an evidentiary and not a doom and gloom perspective, if such neat dissection is possible. The evidence of our current conundromic catastrophe is only building. In the first part of its fifth assessment report released in September last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a United Nations panel, asserted that it is now 95% certain, which is pretty good for science, that humans are the primary cause of climate change in the past half-century. Drafting the IPCC report comprised of more than 600 authors from 39 countries, analysing more than 9,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers with 54,000 comments. No small feat. In January, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology declared 2013 the hottest year since official record taking began in 1910. The February 2013 report of the Australian Climate Council, which is the resurrected, publicly funded reincarnation of the Abbott-abolished Climate Commission, entitled Heat Waves Hotter, Longer and More Often, highlighted that Adelaide, Melbourne and Canberra all experienced a higher average number of hot days between 2000 and 2009 than was expected to occur by 2030. Just 2 days ago in their angry summer report, they analysed climate data from across the country for 2013-2014 summer and concluded that more than 150 weather records were broken. In its January 2014 Global Climate Report, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is reported that globally average temperature over land and ocean surfaces for January 2014 was the 4th highest since reliable record keeping began in 1880. A study released in November last year by the Climate Accountability Institute in Colorado has revealed that the climate crisis of the 21st century has been caused largely by only 90 companies, which between them produce nearly 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions generated since the dawning of the industrial age. The individuals that lead these companies could all fit on a Brisbane bus or 4. This is not dissimilar from the disparity highlighted in a recent Oxfam report that the wealthiest 85 people in the world hold as much wealth as the world's poorest 3.5 billion. Albeit an interrelated subject, it is certainly a topic for another night. That report by the Colorado Institute identifies that half of the estimated emissions were produced just in the past 25 years. And that is well past the date of obvious foreseeability when governments and corporations became aware that greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of coal in the world were causing dangerous climate change. We all obviously cannot discount the fact that we are complicit and responsible for partaking in a fossil fuel economy. As noted by Bill McKibben's Do the Math tour, quote, "It's simple math. We can emit 565 more gigatons of carbon dioxide and stay below over 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which is the threshold for irreversible climate change. Anything more than that risks catastrophe for life on Earth. The only problem, burning the fossil fuel that corporations now have in their reserves and which are factored into the global economy in terms of futures and projected profit forecasts, would result in emitting 2,795 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which is 5 times that safe amount." As to the related question of whether environmental law actually works, a recent example doing the rounds on social media regarding toxic uranium leaked into groundwater from a coal seam gas field owned by one of our George Street neighbours copped a gargantuan fine of $1,500 from the New South Wales government. I like that. It is also worth noting that despite all of the so-called environmental legal protection regimes throughout Australia, very few, if not all, have not received ultimate approval to proceed. Despite all of this mountainous irrefutable evidence and unprecedented worldwide scientific consensus, the Australian government has recently axed the Climate Commission in September 2013, refused to send a delegate to the United Nations Climate Change talks in Warsaw, Poland last November, refused to support the Green Climate Fund supported by the United Nations, is making moves to repeal the very modest climate change abatement and mitigation measures, including the carbon tax and the renewable energy target. And consequently, Australia has sunk to the bottom of the climate change performance index. All of this presents a significant challenge to collective humanity as to how future generations can and will survive going forward. Even now, it is a significant human rights issue, with mainly impoverished and Indigenous people suffering on the frontiers of climate change. This crucial crossroads also represents an important intersection between human rights and environmental issues. Whilst I don't necessarily agree with the artificial distinctions between different strands or generations of human rights, such as the so-called first-generation civil and political rights, second-generation economic and social rights, and third-generation collective and environmental rights, it is instructive to note that environmental rights are being increasingly recognised in international human rights law. For example, the African Charter. But a lot more can and must be done. The right to an environment of quality that permits a life of dignity and well-being can be traced back to the 1972 Stockholm Declaration on the Human Environment, which also held that all individuals bear a solemn responsibility to protect and improve the environment for present and future generations. This is not dissimilar from Dr. Seuss's well-known Loraxian statement: unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. Of course, where the international system is dragging its feet, civil society is stepping up and impressively stepping in, including global Indigenous groups drafting and adopting soft law instruments, including the 2010 Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. That instrument was adopted and drafted at the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia, and the Bolivian government has submitted it to the United Nations for consideration. Indigenous groups globally have drafted and adopted many similar declarations relating to rights for the environment and rights for humans to a healthy environment. So for a profession that is founded on solemn respect for objective expert evidence, surely the vast oceanic tranches of scientific data rationally crashing onto our sensibility shores are legally irrefutable. Why then has the law not downloaded and installed such significant update into its archaic hardware? Perhaps the centuries-old anthropocentric software is incapable of such gargantuan tasks. Perhaps it is obsolete to deal with the real challenges of our modern globalised and eco-fied world. Perhaps what is required are audacious innovations to create a renewed natural legal order based upon the rapid advances of climate science. And that segues nicely into introducing our acclaimed guest speaker this evening. Polly will speak for about half an hour, and then each of the panellists will have a 5 to 7 and not more than 10 minute for a focused response. We will then open the floor to questions. Finally, I must add, or you will be confused, that when I was chasing up our speakers for their respective bios, I threatened them with the substitution of slam poetry in the event that they failed to afford me their bios in a timely fashion. Instead, but for one, they replied that they'd love a slam poetic intro and forwarded no bio. My threat backfired. I have seen Steve and I think Queen's Shakespeare in the Banco talk before, so I'm on safe ground, hopefully. Polly Higgins is a barrister, solicitor and author. Her books are Eradicating Ecocide and Earth is Our Lizards. Polly leads on the Eradicating Ecocide Global Initiative and co-founded the Earth Laws Alliance. She spends most of her time writing, speaking and advising on an international law of ecocide, advising at all levels, governmental, legal and non-legal. Polly connects with a worldwide range of organisations that are working from the same premise, that it is time to say enough to mass damage and destruction of the Earth. Polly is daring to be great, and her wish is to eradicate ecocide by 2020. In recognition of her services to the Earth, she has recently received an honorary business doctorate from the Business School of Lausanne. So in order not to fail to unimpress our international guest, to a short slam poem, I must respectfully digress. And with great audacious aim and rapacious greed for short-term gain, Polly Higgins is ripple-affecting rhythms of wisdom with worldwide acclaim, re-envisioning archaic, outdated systems, articulating planetary passion with persistent precision, while our collective future is feeling foreboding and possibly forbidden in Brisbane. For a summons of subverting and reworking and rebirthing the Earth Law, please welcome global eco-champion Polly Higgins with a warm storm of applause.
back here. I was here in 2011 speaking at the Brisbane Book Writers Festival, which was really magnificent, fun more than anything else, especially because as I was telling someone earlier, I woke up on a Sunday morning and put out an intent in my meditation to have an adventure that day. And lo and behold, after I'd spoken at the Writers' Festival, this man turned up and he said, "Polly, are you up for an adventure?" And I said, "Yes, this is wonderful." And that man, unfortunately, is no longer with us, Wilf. But he was a really special individual, and he really did take me off on an adventure that day and invited many of his friends onto his infamous deck. There were many friends of mine from around the world who actually been on that deck, and we had phenomenal conversations about what was happening to the planet. So I speak with the memory of Will from my right shoulder here. It is an honour, I think, to be alive today. That's the way I see it. We are given an opportunity to either sit back and be a bystander, be an observer of what's happening in the world, or we can stand up and choose to participate and to engage and to contribute to make this world a more beautiful world, and in the words of my very good friend Charles Eisenstein, a more beautiful world than our hearts know is possible. And that's the thing for me, I do know deep within my heart that a more beautiful world is possible. So for me, what I'm doing is I'm putting my skills as a lawyer to good use. And my starting point as a barrister was when I was in court. It was maybe 9 or 10 years ago now, and I found myself representing an individual who'd been very badly injured and harmed in the workplace. It was the very last day of the court case. In fact, it had gone all the way up to the Court of Appeal, and it in fact was Judgment Day. We were invited to stand. Our judges were coming back with judgment, but there was a delay, and I found myself looking out of the windows. We were actually in the very top courtroom in the Royal Courts of Justice in London, and I found myself looking out right across London, across the trees, across the buildings, and thinking, it's not just my client that's been badly injured and harmed, so has the earth. And the next thought actually changed my life. I found myself thinking, the earth's in need of a good lawyer. And it did change my life. I know that now. In fact, what happened there was that I had come to a crossroads, and I was being given an invitation to take a very different path, a path I didn't know where it would take me, but just to take the step onto that path. And that's precisely what I did. I could have remained a barrister, I could have remained making an awful lot of money, but I didn't. I decided to take a year out to examine why was it that we have this problem. Why was it that I was representing big transnational corporations, either the corporation or the employees, in court, and everyone seemed to think that it was absolutely fine to make absolutely loads of money out of causing mass damage and destruction. So I decided to take a year out to look at that. And of course, once I started looking at it, I realized that law had created this problem. It is the law for a CEO and his or her directors to put the interests of the shareholders first, which means to make profit. So law has created this framework where we celebrate the exponential growth of profit and money, no matter what the consequences are. We barely pay lip service to the consequences. But something's changed now. Unlike when we first put in corporate acts and various pieces of legislation that really brought this about and created the business world that we have, we now know the consequences of our actions. So law in a way is playing catch up here. Well, what I did then was I decided to take a year out, and I'm still on my year out. And as I had to admit to my bank manager a few years ago, when she said, "Polly, when are you going to get back and make some real money again?" I had to say, well, actually, I don't think that's ever really going to happen. I'm too far down this rabbit hole of inquiry, and actually, it's far better fun. This really is an adventure, and it's something that's emergent as well, to actually contribute into where our world can go, to actually examine and say, okay, there's a gap here, there are missing laws. How do we do this? How do we create a governing mechanism for earth rights, for the most important right of all, the earth's right to life? And by saying earth, I mean people and planet. Because here's the thing, for me, I say that environmental law is not fit for purpose. It can't be working. You just have to look at the Amazon, the Athabasca tar sands, the super mining proposals that you have here, what's happening to the barrier reef, fracking. Environmental law isn't governing that. And what we are seeing is an escalation of greenhouse gases. A very good report came out last year, the Carbon Majors report, that was 8 years of research, which discovered that 60% of human-caused emissions are as a result of only 68 companies in the world. Now, those companies tend to be extraction, heavy extractive industry, oil, fossil fuel companies on the whole. So this is really about governance at the very top end. How do we actually govern corporations? How do we govern governmental decisions? How do we govern the flow of money and where it's going and where profit is being made? Because of course the flow of money always goes where the biggest profit can be found. And actually that makes sense in a way, because a lot of established industry, which tends to be very destructive, is very much supported by legislative frameworks that allow them to operate in that space. Because of course a lot of law is made by companies as they move forward. Now we know that it comes at a very high price, and I don't mean an economic price. It's the intrinsic value rather than the imposed value. It comes at a great cost to humanity, to nature, and to future generations. I asked myself a really powerful question that day in court when I found myself thinking the earth is in need of a good lawyer. I asked myself, how can we create a legal duty of care for the earth? And this was a question that I looked to try and find the answer. And what I did was I looked out to see what other lawyers were out there in this space who were creating new laws to help protect the earth. And not just more environmental laws that were based on fines. I call them catch me if you can laws. But actually something that is preemptive, that is ensuring a first do no harm principle. And what I discovered actually, I discovered the community I was looking for. I started to tap into those lawyers who were engaging in earth jurisprudence, Cormac Cullinan and others. But I was coming from a different background. I was coming from the world of corporate law. I was looking for tools that I could use in court. I'm a court advocate. I wanted those laws that would help me and would help those companies that I understand very well to stop causing mass damage and destruction. Not to close them down, of course not, but to create the enabling conditions so that the problem can become the solution. And what I discovered was that nobody was actually out there creating these new laws. And I kind of went round and discovered that many people were engaging in the debate of the jurisprudence of it all, and that opened up a whole new engagement of conversation for me, which was truly fantastic, especially around indigenous wisdom, which actually I knew nothing about 5-6 years ago. Now I've met many indigenous leaders across the world, but then that was an unknown territory for me. I really was a corporate lawyer through and through. And I found myself thinking, well, actually we've got missing law here. So what I did was I proposed, in fact, more than that, I had a conversation with my husband, always my starting point. And I had a big conversation with him of what if we had a universal declaration, rather like Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what if we had one for the planet, what would that look like? It was my 40th birthday, and so we went up the west coast of Scotland, which is a place that's very dear to my heart. It's my sacred land, if you like. To go there and go walking up the hills and talk this big idea through, a universal declaration of planetary rights or something like that. What would those fundamental rights and freedoms be? And very quickly, I got to the point that I had 12 core fundamental rights and freedoms, and we were talking about this, and I was saying, yes, but you know, we need to get this into the United Nations. How on earth do I get a big idea like this into the United Nations? And here's the funny thing. I ended up a mountain where we had no access to internet. There was no mobile phone connectivity. We were in the middle of nowhere in the west coast of Scotland. And I pulled my phone out of my back pocket and thought, you know, I'll just see if there's reception here. Turned it on, and that very moment, it rang, and it was the United Nations. Now, I don't have a hotline to the United Nations. I still don't have a hotline to the United Nations, although I've spent a lot more time in there since then. But it was one of those truly remarkable moments where you think, wow, someone heard me up here, something happened there, that maybe there's something bigger at play here. Now, call me superstitious, call me spiritual, I don't know, but for me, there's something greater at play here. And here I had someone on the end of the phone wanting to know if I'd speak on a conference about women and the environment. And I said, no, I want to talk about something far bigger instead. I want to talk about a really big idea. What about this universal declaration for the earth? That's what I want to talk about. And so, of course, she had no idea what I was talking about. This was a nutty idea. So I asked her to write it down, find someone, and go and ask them if I could come and speak about that. But be quick, please, because it's going to rain. And she phoned back in 15 minutes and said, they're very excited in HQ. Forget that conference over there. We'd like you to talk at our International Climate Change Conference in 5 months' time. I asked, what's HQ? Oh, it's the Security Council. Okay, good. What do I do now? So I treated it like a legal brief. I ditched everything, and for 5 months I subjected it to intense legal scrutiny. And within 5 months I then was in a position to speak about this very big idea. Now after that, things moved very, very fast. And what was truly wonderful was I brought together some lawyers, including Cormac Cullinan, whom I'm sure many of you know. And Cormac, in fact, within 10 months, Bolivia got in touch, and Cormac Cullinan then took that forward. Now, as he was taking that forward and taking it into a deeper drafting stage, then we had the climate negotiations. And I know at least one person in this audience who was there. And I was invited up to Copenhagen to speak on one particular platform there with a British journalist called George Monbiot. In fact, we were waiting for Eva Morales to come and join us on stage, but he got held up in negotiations. And so we were waiting and kind of trying to fill this space, and 40 minutes turned into, I think, 3 hours in total. I drank a lot of water on that table. And we opened it up, we talked about the idea of a universal declaration of planetary rights or earth rights. What were earth rights? It was a very exciting, dynamic conversation with 4,000, maybe 5,000 people altogether. And we opened it up to the audience. And one man stood up and he said, you know, we need a new language to deal with this mass damage and destruction. And it was one of those light bulb moments. I found myself thinking, yeah, you know, you're right. It's like genocide, only it's ecocide. Oh wow, that should be a crime. Why is this not a crime? If we are to give governance to the earth's right to life, then surely it needs the criminality of that, and that's ecocide. Because after all, our human right to life is governed on a one-to-one by the crime of murder or homicide in America. But if it's myself and all of us here, then we're looking at the crime of genocide. So rights are always balanced by duties and obligations. Rights and responsibilities, if you like. One cannot stand in isolation without the other. And this was very powerful for me because I suddenly realized that actually it was as if we were moving forward in this evolution of earth law, where we were beginning to recognize the missing laws that are required here. I rushed back from Copenhagen and I went down that rabbit hole of rigorous scrutiny and inquiry once again. Literally for 3 months I researched the idea of making ecocide a crime. And what I discovered was not only was it required, was it missing as an international crime, but actually we could fast track this. It didn't have to take decades to get it put in place, and this was very exciting for me. What I did was I proposed into the United Nations Law Commission a definition for the word ecocide. I didn't know it then, but we've discovered since that, in fact, the word itself goes back to the 1940s. In fact, very recently, just within the last year, more documents have just surfaced. But what I did was I submitted into the United Nations a legal definition. Ecocide is the extensive damage, destruction to or loss of ecosystems. And there are two types of ecocide. There's human-caused ecocide, largely but not entirely corporate ecocide. But there's also another type of ecocide, and that's naturally occurring ecocide. Rising sea levels, tsunamis, floods. To such an extent that peaceful enjoyment of the inhabitants has been severely diminished. It's not just peaceful enjoyment of human beings, but it's the inhabitants of a given territory. Because if you look at any given territory, it's not just human beings who live there. So this was a proposal that was based on actually 3 fundamental values that really govern me, in truth. The first being the interconnectedness of life, the fundamental recognition that we destroy the world that we walk on, we destroy our ability to live in peaceful enjoyment. The second one being that life itself is sacred. I do genuinely believe that. Who are we to destroy this world continually? Life is the most sacred thing of all. You can argue for all your rights to the correspondence, but if someone comes along and shoots you, it takes away your life, and nothing else really matters. And surely this is about expanding our cycle of concern to understand it's not just about human-to-human engagement, but it's about human-to non-human engagement as well. And the third principle, the third value that I attach to this is love. Love of humanity, love of earth, love for life itself. So it's not so much a law against something, but it's a law for life. It's a unifying law, it's a catalyst for the more beautiful world. Because actually, what I also realized, and I spent a lot of time in my bedroom walking up and down, saying to myself, can it really be right that we create another crime, an international crime at that? Is this really what's required here? And I really wrestled with my conscience on this. You know, we've got so much law already that doesn't work. How would this work any better? Is there any reason for this? Is it right that we create another crime? And the answer that came back to me very forcefully was yes, it is required. And I found it very interesting when I first proposed this and when it first really went big in the world, and it really took off very fast, was that I discovered when genocide was first proposed as an international crime, and I know this from Jewish friends, There were certain people who did not want it to be made a crime within the Jewish community because it meant facing up to the enormity of what had occurred. And in a way, it's kind of true of ecocide as well. Just before I went up to Copenhagen, I was given incredible indigenous advice by a friend. And she said, only when we face the shadow self and give it name can the healing begin. And in a way, this is what a lot of ecocide is doing. It's facing the shadow self and saying mass damage and destruction, this is ecocide. And we name it. Only then can healing begin. Can we bring in the restorative justice? What I didn't expect was when I proposed this in that it would take off so fast. Literally within a matter of weeks, the Guardian newspaper in Brisbane got in touch and said, Polly, this is a big idea, we want to report this. And by the way, do you have a website? Because people will want to read about this. So they gave me a week and said, yeah, if you can get a website together in a week, this will be really good, we'll put it out in a week's time. The very next day they phoned and said, actually we're putting it out now. It just so happened I had my website wizard beside me, Roman, and we were literally putting up a website as it was going out, not just in paper form, but online. And as we were putting up Facebook and Twitter, we saw this article going across the world in a way that just, I couldn't believe. We sat there utterly amazed. The website itself had 28,000 hits that weekend alone. It was just phenomenal. And it triggered a huge amount of activity all across the world, because this was the thing, the word ecocide is actually very well known in different countries. Ecocidio in Central America and South America is very well known. There's a lot of ecocidio playing out there. And in fact, when I was in Cancun for the climate negotiations, many people were engaging in the idea of ecocidio there. It received huge front page coverage because there was so much ecocidio playing out. And in particular with the whole idea that there was a lot of ecocidio coming from the global north, from American companies that were destroying vast tracts of territory, in particular in the Amazon, of course, that was ecocidio. So it's a word that actually has its own power. And I didn't know that it had a history until a journalist got in touch and asked for my views on the fact that ecocide had very nearly become an international crime in the 1990s. And I knew nothing about this. This was like gold dust, if you like. What he did have, he'd managed to source a UN document. All UN documents have coding. And it referenced another document that had a code to the fact that ecocide had been removed at the last minute from becoming an international crime. This was amazing to me. I had no idea. So I did what every normal human being would do. I went on the UN website, put in the code to find this document with great excitement, and it came up, error, document unknown. So I phoned up the United Nations and said, I'm trying to find this document, here's the code. Oh yeah, you go on the website, you can get it. Well, it says error, document unknown. Oh, that's not our responsibility. Well, whose responsibility is it? Let me put you through to this department. And I'd have this conversation and say, oh, that's not our responsibility. Okay, can you put me on someone? And this went on for 2 hours through the UN. I was put through department, and eventually I got back to the first guy and spoken to him. And it went full circle, and I realised that it was kind of like the UN itself. Nobody was willing to take responsibility for a broken link on a website. Someone must know how to fix these things. So I realised that actually what I needed to do was get into the basement. The UN must have a basement with all these documents. I needed a mole to go in there, but you need special access. More than that, I needed a mole who knew what he or she was doing, because actually there was a paper trail to be found here. But in the meantime, I was approached by a group of nations who invited me to a meeting in Switzerland and asked me just how fast can we put this law in place. So what I did was I put together a concept paper, and in fact I didn't just take it back into those 16 countries. At that time I had an office and team, thanks to a wonderful American donor. We took it into every single government in the world. And the concept paper proposes that this can be tabled for amendment next year, 2015. The Rome Statute is up for review then. And all it requires to be tabled is, in fact, just one head of state to propose it. And then it requires just 2/3 majority of the signatories to the Rome Statute. That's out of 122 signatories, that's 82 countries now. Actually, that's 82 people in the world, far less than we have sitting here today. So there's a surprisingly few amount of people that actually can have this put in place. I propose a 5-year amnesty period, transition period, so that we can change our business operations, we can realign government policy, and we can move very fast. Now that may sound absolutely utopian, but in truth, it depends on whether or not you think we're in a state of emergency. And of course, a state of emergency is just a state of emergence. It's the opportunity for something new to emerge. Just how serious a position are we in now today? And what help and what assistance and what enabling conditions can we put in place to allow the problem to turn into a solution? Dirty energy to become clean energy. And we're talking about triggering a clean economy here, scaling up jobs at an enormous scale right across the world, creating a level playing field. And I'm going to be talking more about the business aspects here in Brisbane and Fighting Out. There's a second event where we'll dig down into that at a deeper level. But what was so wonderful was that after taking in the concept paper into all governments, I happened to be in the University of London, talking to students about this. When walking down the stairs, I was chatting to Dr. Damien Short. He's an expert in genocide. And I said to him, I don't know, I feel I ought to ask you this. You wouldn't happen to know anyone who would have access to the United Nations basement that could pull out a few documents? And he said, yeah, Polly, I'm going there in 2 weeks' time with a group of students. I have special access. What would you like to do? Well, this was magnificent. What he dug out, he and the students, was truly remarkable. It wasn't just one document. They came back with 2 lever arch files this thick, and they could have kept on going. I reckon if we left someone down there for a year, we would have turned a whole load more. But what we discovered was that documentation going back to 1972 and the Stockholm Conference was actually opened with a call for ecocide to be made an international crime. In fact, a working group on crimes against the environment was set up there and then, and Dr. Richard Falk drafted up a draft ecocide convention, which was put forward the following year. So this is an idea that's been around for quite some time. And I kind of know this because I get emails from people telling me that they thought up a law of ecocide way before I did. And I say, great! So can you please get out there and help make this happen? Because this is the thing, nobody has ownership over a good idea. It's almost as if it's in there, in the consciousness, and we kind of pull it down and it pops up in different places. But more importantly than the Stockholm Conference, what we discovered was a paper trail demonstrating that when the Rome Statute was being drafted, and it was drafted from 1985 until 1997, was that in the drafting of it, which was the codification of the existing international crimes and putting in place of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, it was not just genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, but also putting in place provisions definitions for crimes of aggression, precursor to war, and ecocide. And here I've been proposing that the Rome Statute be amended and that there was a missing fifth crime against peace. And indeed this very much was the case. It was missing. Amazingly, Dr. Damien Shorten and students found some very crucial documents. They found the minutes of one of the very last meetings of the working group on crimes against the environment. What we had was documentation covering 1985 to 1996, where ecocide was being drafted as part of that document, until in a meeting, closed-door meeting, it was announced by the head of the working group on crimes against the environment that he was going to remove ecocide, even though many countries had gone on record by that stage to say that they supported it. And indeed, member state representatives stood up and objected to having it removed. No reasons were given, and it was removed as a wartime crime and a peace crime. And in fact, Article 82B, which deals with crimes against the environment, was watered down. It was a watered down version. A compromise took place. Now, this all happened behind closed doors. And yet, hundreds, if not thousands, of people had been involved in that drafting process. Special UN rapporteurs, lawyers, member state representatives, various UN-related agencies were all involved in that 11 years. And we have a huge amount of documentation for this now. And yet it was dropped, and very soon after that, the working group on crimes against the environment was closed down. Now I'm happy to say that's now just been put back in place just last year in the United Nations, which is fantastic. But the thing was, this just literally dropped off the radar. Now, we also happen to have not just the minutes of that meeting, some incredibly good minutes, and I'm so grateful that we did, but also we have the opinions of the special rapporteurs at the time. They left their own records of why this happened. These are not my opinions, this is the opinions of the rapporteurs then, that it was as a result of lobbying of 4 countries. It was the US, it was the UK, it was France, and the Netherlands. This all happened behind closed doors. I didn't know about this, you didn't know about this, nobody knew about it. And once it was removed, there was nothing could be done about it. Now, 1996 was a very pivotal year for a number of reasons. It was the year that unconventional tar extraction was ramped up in a very big way. The Netherlands had oil companies that were based there and wanted to expand in a big way. Fracking as well was beginning to be ramped up in the States. In fact, it was the first year that genetic modification, when genetically modified goods went on supermarket shelves in America. It was also the year that there was a very pivotal judgment on nuclear weapons, the use of nuclear weapons in the International Court of Justice, which didn't quite go as far as it was anticipated, and it was felt that there was pressure brought to bear that year, that the judgment that was anticipated didn't quite happen to say that this is unlawful activity. In the opinion of the UN rapporteurs, they said that this was vested oil and fossil fuel interests and also nuclear interess. That it was also because there isn't so much money to be made out of nuclear energy that there is out of the secondary industry of depleted uranium for the use of nuclear weapons. What took place then? We'll never know exactly what happened, but we have an idea. So this is the thing, this time round, I'm open sourcing everything about this. Everything that I've talked about is out there, it's online, on the Eradicating Ecocide website. Everything's under Creative Commons licensing, it's all open sourced, so that this time around it doesn't just get swept under the table. But here's the beauty of it. The most fantastic thing is that you just can't keep a good idea down. Try and push it down over there and just pop up over here. And this is really one idea whose time has come, without a doubt. So it's my invitation to you to help me, because it's certainly not going to take just one lawyer to do this, it's going to take many, many lawyers and non-lawyers to help take this forward in whatever way we can and see this out. It's equally important, not just that it's taken in at the top end, but it comes also from the bottom end, literally the grassroots. It's by creating also, and this is something that I've heard from various member states, have said to me, what we require is a public mandate to move forward with this. The people's voice. And maybe this is really about it being the people's law as well. Because this is a crime against humanity. It's a crime against nature, and it's a crime against future generations. But more than that, in truth, it's a crime for peace. Thank you very much.